Thank you all so much for being here. This is a lovely group and a big one. I'm anyone that knows me, which is a lot of you, know that I really don't like this lecture style formats, which is why I asked you to come up, but you guys did a great job. I am going to lean and trust you heavily to be able to participate in this because after all, it's a let's talk. And I designed it to be a discussion. I was hoping we could be in a circle, so we'll pretend. Try to have the circle spirit in the room. So as people come in, I'm just going to start with introducing myself. My name is Callie Lantrip, and I'm a psychologist at UCSB. That's the moment to read? No. Okay. And in addition to being a psychologist there, I also am the interpersonal violence specialist. And this was actually the first position in the UC system to have a career position devoted to trauma. And since then, we've had two other ones get hired, one at UC Irvine, who's not here, and one at UC Santa Cruz, who's in the audience. So this is something I feel really passionate about talking about, trauma, and it's something I do all day, every day. So at this point at UCSB, my entire caseload is interpersonal violence. So most hours of the day, I am seeing clients that have dealt with some sort of interpersonal trauma. What I want to do today is widen that conversation away from the typical conversation we have about sexual assault on campus and have it be a broader conversation about the idea of betrayal and what betrayal does to us as human beings. And this topic definitely started blooming in my head as we were getting closer to the election. So I'm just going to name that, and there's going to be, pieces of it today that I will weave in from that. But this is really about you all helping me and me helping you and us thinking together about how betrayal plays out in all of our lives and the effects that it has on us. And I'll be leaning on frameworks of attachment theory and betrayal trauma that I've used in my work with interpersonal violence survivors. So I would like to start. I know this is the last session and people are tired, so I thought I'd get you on your feet. It's the only time I'm going to do this, and don't get up yet. So I'm just going to do a little activity, and I want to name before I start that, first of all, this is all about courageous dialogue, so feel free to not participate if it feels like that's not something you want to do. And in acknowledging that, I want to acknowledge that there is a video camera taping us. Which is more awkward for me than it is for you, I promise. So what I would like to start with is I am going to go through some ways that we all might have been betrayed in our lives. And they're broad categories, so nothing too personal. But I would love for people to stand up when they hear one that resonates with something that happened in their life and to stay standing, okay? And again, if it makes you uncomfortable, please stay seated. It's no big deal. So I'd like you to stand up if you feel like you were betrayed by a parent, betrayed by a peer, betrayed by a teacher, betrayed by a dating or romantic partner, betrayed by an educational institution, betrayed by state or federal laws, by law enforcement. You can just stay standing if you're already standing. Stand up if you're betrayed by the justice system, by higher education, by your community. Stand up if you've ever felt betrayed by an employment opportunity, or lack thereof. Stand up if you've ever been betrayed by the political system. Okay, and what about if you've been felt betrayed by media representation? Okay, so I'd like you to look around the room. And I also want to acknowledge that I would say 90% of you stood up within the first three. You can sit down now. So I wanted to have that frame the conversation, and this is not to diminish or take away from the very real work that I, and I'm sure most of you do with survivors of very violent experiences. And at the same time, I want that to kind of be able to impact or have us have awareness of betrayal in these other ways that aren't necessarily an experience that someone might define that way. So our goals today are to take a closer look at the theory and framework behind interpersonal betrayal trauma, to look closely at daily exchanges that use gender or race to increase or highlight power differentials as a type of betrayal trauma, and through that to gain some insight into how current sociopolitical climate, also giving acknowledgement to historical inequality and injustice, is impacting mental health and creating common trauma responses in all of us and our clients. So I'm going to start with highlighting the unique aspect of interpersonal violence specifically, and this is a presentation that I give often on campus. And these 4 areas are pieces that I really see as unique to interpersonal violence that's different than, say, a car crash. So the difference between interpersonal violence and other traumas that don't involve human betrayal is that interpersonal human piece. So a lot of the work that I do around betrayal trauma, I need to give credit to Jennifer Fried from the University of Oregon. If you haven't heard of her, she's a very interesting person and has a lot to offer, so you can look up her work. She came up with this quadrant, what do you call that? That shows the difference between, not generally traumatic on the left-hand side. Up on the top side is high social betrayal, but low terror, which we think about with the PTSD diagnosis. And then as you go to the right, the bottom right is terror-inducing, but doesn't have the social betrayal piece. So the thing about the idea of betrayal trauma is that it's a violation of trust. I actually want to pause. I didn't start with what is betrayal. So let's start with just hearing, when you guys were standing up and you were hearing me say, you've been betrayed by a parent, you've been betrayed by an institution. Let's throw out some ideas of how we're defining betrayal and how it's different than maybe being hurt. Anyone have thoughts? Violating trust, great. Other thoughts about what makes the idea of betrayal unique? Yeah. Questioning yourself. Great, we're going to come to that. So a little bit of a crazy making, maybe, like what's happening for me that's creating this dynamic in this relationship. Other thoughts about, if I had said, yeah, great. Beautiful. So she said, someone acting in a hurtful way that goes against the expectations of that relationship. So the idea of betrayal is that, and I'll actually read Jennifer Fried's definition of betrayal trauma, is people or institutions on which a person depends on for survival or safety, significantly violating that trust or your well-being. So the idea is this is somebody or something that you're betting on to be able to feed you, to keep you safe, to be loved by, to support you financially, to protect you from the law or whatever. So betrayal is a violation of trust, and the greater the person relies on that person for basic needs or that institution, the greater the likelihood is for this idea of betrayal blindness. And we're going to get to this in different ways during this presentation, but betrayal blindness is again from Jennifer Fried, but it's similar to a lot of things that a lot of you think about, like dissociation or numbing out or not thinking about it or compartmentalizing it or pretending that it was actually something that you did wrong and making excuses for the person. So those things all become really important when you're trying to preserve a relationship that's really vital to your survival, right? So in order to maintain internal locus of control, you end up blaming yourself. So this is what Brianna was talking about. So the idea of this is sort of like if you're a child and you're getting beaten by a parent, and that parent is the person that you rely on for safety, shelter, food, everything, it doesn't make sense to believe that that parent figure is bad. That's really an out-of-control thing to think, because if that parent is bad, then that leaves you completely helpless. It's a lot easier and makes sense cognitively for brains, especially little brains, to believe that you're doing something wrong to create that abuse, because then you maintain control, right? So if I just get this right, they'll stop doing this. The same thing plays out in adulthood. So we try to figure out ways that we're creating this to maintain that internal locus of control. Any questions about anything on this slide? Okay. the next two pieces are the idea of entrapment. Who has heard of Judith Herman and her work? Great. Okay, so Judith Herman was, I think, the first person to write about this idea of entrapment, and it's something that has really resonated with me throughout my work. So she wrote about psychological entrapment too, but she mostly wrote about the idea of actually being a prisoner, like in a basement, and what that does to one's brain when you actually can't fight or run, like you're literally trapped, and how it actually shuts normal functioning down in a lot of different ways. So what's more interesting to me is how this happens in psychological entrapment. So the idea of you cannot fight someone and you cannot run away because you're relying on them for any of these things we've mentioned. Any of the categories that I read out at the beginning would be people or institutions that you would have relied on and that would have felt important to you to maintain that. So thinking about how social norms, socialization, internalized self-blame in our society, confusion, possibly all those things happening at one time, keep you from feeling like you can use your normal responses that you would in a dangerous situation. So I'm guessing most of you have heard about the freeze response. I'd like to take that a step further and just quickly explain the idea of tonic immobility, which I think is really important. So tonic immobility is what they're looking at now in interpersonal violence as a deeper freeze response. So the freeze response is actually just like a quick, like, oh, I haven't made a decision of what I'm doing. But an actual sense of feeling paralyzed is called tonic immobility. And the idea of it is that it happens a lot in these situations where attachment is creating an environment where it feels confusing what the right thing to do is, where maybe you love the person that's hurting you, and so it doesn't make sense to hit them or to get up and run away. So you're maintaining that attachment. And so your brain and body actually go into a freeze response. What I think is interesting about this for our discussion is I'm going to show a clip of a video of someone not being paralyzed, frozen, and I will just say, just so you all know, that I would say in the survivors I work with, I would estimate about 85% of survivors of sexual assault that I talk to on our college campus will respond to, yes, I felt paralyzed at some point. So this tonic immobility is like a really, really common thing, so just good for you to know. So taking this broader in terms of the betrayals we talked about at the beginning, I'm really interested in the little tonic immobility that happens in all of us all the time, and how this kind of idea of socialization makes it difficult for us to do maybe what we sort of would want to do if we thought about something theoretically. So someone says something nasty to you, you want to be like, F you or whatever, and yet why don't we? What happens in those moments? And I think that is really fascinating, and that some of this work can relate to this. So I'm going to show you a clip that is probably fairly triggering for most of us, but you probably also have mostly seen it. Maybe? without having seen it yet, which will all bring it more to light, but I know most of you have seen it anyway. Does anyone have any thoughts about how culture or identities that have been historically or currently marginalized would play into this conversation so far? Thinking about learning to de-escalate or feeling like, hi, it's just not connecting to the internet properly. The next slide is the video. Yeah.
De-escalating is a way to protect yourself, or to stay safe. If I engage, if I say F you, so to speak,
Right.
that puts me at more risk in a situation that I'm already kind of getting warning signs of.
Absolutely. Could people hear that in the back? Okay, so she said that if you're in a situation where you're already getting warning signs that you might be in danger, that de-escalation or different tools to kind of not confront the situation might be really important to not create further unsafety. Any other, yeah?
Also social conditioning. Like for example, as women, women are often taught to think of other people's feelings, not make a fuss, not cause waves, and that can conflict with a situation where you feel at risk.
Absolutely. So she was using women as an example. As a collective, are oftentimes taught to be polite and go with the social norms, not make other people uncomfortable. Yeah. Deeply ingrained misogyny and sexism in our culture, yes. Other kind of thoughts of how to widen this conversation as we head into this video? Any thoughts about the freeze response and how it relates to you all day to day? Is the link between those two things connecting? Perfect, thank you. Hold that thought. Actually, I want to fast forward a little. Thank you.
You know, fall out of the bus. Hello, how are you? Hi.
Trump, how
nice
are
seeing you.
Pleasure to
Terrific.
meet you.
Terrific. You know Billy Bush?
How are you?
Nice to see you. How you doing, Ariane?
I'm doing very well, thank you. Are you ready to be a soap star?
We're ready. Let's go. Make me a soap star.
How about a little hug for the Donald? He just got off the
Would you
bus.
like a little hug,
Okay,
darling?
absolutely.
How about a
Melania
little
said
hug for
this
the
was
bushy?
okay.
I just got off the bus.
Oh, bushy.
There we go. Excellent. Well,
Come
you've
on.
got a nice co-star here.
Good.
Yes, absolutely.
After you. Come on, Billy. Don't be shy.
As soon as a beautiful woman shows up, he takes
Get over
off
here,
on
Billy.
He's always happy.
I'm sorry, come here.
Let the little guy in there. Come
Yeah,
on.
let the little guy in. How you feel now, better? I should actually.
It's hard to walk next to a guy like
Here, wait,
this.
hold on.
Yeah, you get in the middle. There we go.
Good. That's
This
better.
is much better. This is.
That's better.
Now, if you had to choose, honestly, between one of us, me or the Donald, who
No,
would
no,
it
no.
be?
That's tough
some pressure
competition.
right
Yeah.
Seriously, I mean, you had to take one of us as a date.
You have to take the fifth on that one.
Really?
Yep, I'll take both.
Which way?
Make it right. Here we go.
Goodbye.
Right in the days.
Here he goes. I'm going to leave you here.
Okay.
Get my microphone.
Okay.
Okay, so thoughts, reactions. Yes.
So a reaction that I have is you can sense her discomfort in this clip, but also how skillful she is at navigating this situation and catering, to both of them. And that it just seems very familiar for her. I think what was different about this clip is we got to hear what happened before it, which is typically more of a gut feeling in these sorts of interactions. And also that this is a situation with such a power differential, that she's at her place of business, she's been put in this role, she's supposed to be catering, to this power.
Yes, I'm hoping people could hear that because that was a lot of good points. I want to point out one thing that's so interesting that I've been just listening to myself having these conversations too, is you use the word right at the beginning, skillful. And I do think we put positive attributes, especially on women, of being able to do this. And this is like, I don't know about all of you, but this is really hard for me to watch, and would be even if I didn't know what he had just said on the bus, and yet we wouldn't even have seen, this wouldn't even have when made the news. All of us in this room have experienced something like this, I'm sure. Other thoughts? Yeah. So maybe that pieces of this are enculturated in some way into this industry, maybe many. I saw some head nods when I said that. Other thoughts? Any non-women perspectives? Oh, I'll take another woman. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm wondering what you all feel like it feels like to be in that situation. I'm hoping everybody in the room can put themselves in this moment. What does it feel like to have to do this? Trapped. What else? Uncomfortable, annoyed, resentful, paralyzing. Only option, nauseating, dehumanizing. Scary. Conflicted. Uh-huh. Okay. I would really like to hear more from both of those.
Thinking of this kind of secondary reaction to feeling nauseated, uncomfortable, and frozen, which is then like a kind of automatic and very internalizing of social and societal norms of then self-rewarding for it. Like, oh, I navigated that well.
Uh-huh.
Or I got clear of something. I really missed some kind of confrontation
Uh-huh.
because I was so skillful.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of self-rewarding can be so much more, I don't know, insidious and difficult to manage
Uh-huh.
in the long run than even the rewards that we get out there.
Totally. So she was talking about the internalized, almost like, whew, I handled that well, like the successful feeling of it, balanced with the maybe disgust or feeling really bad. Would you mind expanding on that just a little bit for us? What you?
Well, I've had the experience where I definitely sort of played along and then afterwards feel like, oh, I know better than that. I know that I want to say the F you. I want to be able to say go away. But I don't often be brave in the moment or this is what I'm used to doing. This is what I'm socialized. And so when I'm frustrated with myself, know better.
Yeah.
Like, you have education. You go to these workshops. Like,
Right.
you should be able to say screw you and walk away. And yet I don't. Sometimes, a majority of the time, I think she's here.
Yes. Thank you for saying that and sharing that, because that was really where I wanted it to go. Yeah.
And then it feels like added on to that is like then they got away with it, or they.
So now I've just added to the problem, or yeah. Uh-huh. Was there a hand over here? No? Oh.
I was just thinking about how when you've had an experience where you have taken a stand and it starts to release the behavior because it's about boundaries
Mm-hmm.
your attempts, your boundary setting, your setting up for yourself leads to more aggression,
Uh-huh.
then how much more likely are we to play along? And then I think what the shame comes from, like, yeah, making it seem okay when it's not.
So the learned response. Sure. So it's a double bind. It's a lose-lose scenario, and the learned response that it might make it worse to try to set a boundary. Ooh, so many good hands. Let's go in the back.
I think there's also very prevalent that if you first boundaries
Yeah. Right. Yes, thank you. Beautifully said. So if anyone couldn't hear that, there's just a feeling of like, if I say something, we know where that's gonna go, right? Suddenly it's gonna be on me, I'm the bitch, I'm the one that can't take a joke, take things too seriously. I'm always talking about things around sexual violence, that girl. So instead, we already know, we already can see that play out, right? And so that adds to the freeze. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. That's nice and articulate and perfect. Right. Yeah. How can I boil that complexity down? Yeah. Right. Right. And so that leads to another barrier, which is hopelessness, right? Feeling like there's nothing really we're going to say in the moment that's going to make the systemic change that would need to happen. Louisa, did you have?
My reaction at first, it gave me some insight into how some people are applying to those issues. Or rationalization, or not even so much self-blame, but kind of like before I was more kind of feel, and I haven't experienced stuff like that. I've never really
Mm-hmm.
kind of like so normal. And so when I first watched this right now, I wasn't like I feel uncomfortable, but it like didn't make sense to really see
Figure out what the, yeah.
what was even happening.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I think that like the sometimes that process of like it might be self-blame, but it can also just be
Sure. Right. That was such a nice segue. Because I would like to, if I can figure out what's going on here. I'd like to give you all just a case example. So I'm bringing this back to identified interpersonal violence for a minute, but I want us to draw on everything we just said. So I worked with a girl in the last year, and I'll say girl, she was 18. She had just come to our university, and she was, and just so you know, I've changed details, and but I want to give you guys a sense of this. So she was Filipina and was from a very close family. She was a virgin and proud to be a virgin and was planning to wait until marriage. And she got here and was excited about dating. And she went on Tinder and she got ready for a date that she was gonna go on with her friends. They picked out her outfit. And when she first came to me, she told me, I guess I shouldn't have worn this outfit. It was too easy to take off. But before that thought had been the thought of taking pictures with her friends and getting ready and being excited. And she was gonna meet the guy on the street halfway. And he said he was sick. He wasn't feeling well. And he would like for her to just meet him at his house. And she thought that seemed like a nice thing to do for someone that was feeling sick. So she got to his house, and he pretty immediately got her into his room and began forcing her to have sex. And she said, you know what, I'm a virgin. That's not why I'm here. I really don't want to have sex now or this year. And he said, okay, don't worry about it, don't worry about it. And forced assaulted her. And then she told me, And then I cuddled with him. And then when I was done cuddling, I got up and I realized I needed to get home. And he was sleeping. And so I woke him up and I asked him to walk me home. And he said, no. And she said, and that was the moment I realized that something was really wrong. And so she went home on her own in the middle of the night and had a really shattered sense of self and others. And I bring up this story, this case example, because this is the most common case ever, right? Like I could be talking about anybody. And of course that's awful and disgusting and so sad. And what I hear over and over and over again from people is, why on earth would I have cuddled with him? And they, they tell their friends, they might not even tell that detail to their friends, but they tell them, I don't know, like, I didn't want to lose my virginity, but like, maybe I acted like whatever. They're so confused. And I want to bring it to this conversation that we're having about, we're all trained professionals and we're confused in the room how to turn down a hug when we don't want it, right? So how are people feeling hearing that case example? Or can people relate to that case example in terms of clients or the wider conversation we're having? I'm seeing some nodding. I'd love to hear thoughts. Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to give you the microphone because you're so small.
I working with trauma clients, I hear it over and over again, and it's so hard. I sometimes feel a parallel process of helplessness when I'm dealing with that. Even in the example video you were showing, I wondered even if there was, because of socialization too and sexism, there might have been even some piece within her that maybe something felt good amidst all the disgust and all the other things, and how that could lead to confusion and some kind of behavioral response then or emotion then after about it that could happen in these kind of situations too.
Thank you for bringing that up. I noticed no one said that about the video, but there sometimes is a weird flattery confusion mixed in with some of these things that I think is important to say out loud sometimes. If you haven't already learned this about me, I'm all about saying some things we don't normally say, so feel free to join me in that. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm making a huge assumption that interaction felt uncomfortable for her, and we've all collectively made that assumption together without talking with her. And the place that I really resonate with that is with intakes and with clients that come in and they're confused, and how can we hold that and join them in the confusion without deciding for them what's just happened or how they should feel about it, especially knowing that different routes they take with that could make healing harder in some ways if we decide for them that this is going to be a life-defining thing. Other thoughts about the case example and how it relates? Any reactions to the case example? Yeah.
I feel like a common dynamic in a lot of examples like this are people that want so badly to feel love or approval from someone else that sort of like they're willing to put up with something bad to get it. And then when they don't get it, it adds to the confusion. And there's so many conflicting wants and
parents and mentors are just as confused. Yeah.
So like people don't often get direct instructions on like what is your first sexual experience supposed to look like, or what is a date supposed to look like,
Right.
and how is somebody supposed to treat you. So it's confusing, and then it's like, well, if they cuddled with me, then maybe it's okay.
Right.
There's so many different things that people want out of sex or out of a date or out of
Yeah.
a relationship, and they can't all always go together, and especially for us, obviously, that's a situation.
Yeah. So let's take it a step further, and I don't totally know the answer to this in real life, but let's say she had asked to cuddle. Why do we think she might have done that? Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Right. Right. Great. So you touched on like 6 different pieces that are all important. So reclaiming control of your body, reclaiming control of the narrative of what happened. And then there's also the attachment piece, right? Like maybe if we cuddle, maybe if he walks me home, maybe he's not a terrible person, and maybe that means what felt like what just happened didn't happen, because if you're not a terrible person, you wouldn't do what so trying to kind of reconnect that attachment. Yeah.
I was just kind of struck with that. There's a lot of confusion, and yet when didn't walk along with that.
Sure. Yeah.
So maybe that was part of the answer. That's clear.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it was concrete and it was simple and less difficult to think about. Yeah. Yeah.
I think a piece of this ties into your comment too is the cultural aspect. I mean, you said that she's a Filipino student. I'm Filipino, and not every culture discusses sex, healthy relationships, emotional intimacy, and so certainly if this is someone's first time, um, it is very likely in Filipino culture that there was not a discussion around what a healthy response, care, looks like in that space. So I think a big piece of this is culture.
Here and then back.
Yeah, I wonder if one of the things that she might be thinking is that, well, he got what he wanted, and if I get a little something of what I get, maybe this is more okay. That she's trying to get a little something from that experience. Cuddling, maybe that's one of the pieces that she was maybe looking for out of that experience, and really didn't go the way that think that it was.
Trying to make it okay, because that would preserve everything, right? Yeah. Almost. Help me a little bit. So, connecting it back to kind of where it started as a social experience to go on the date. Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. there's so many pieces to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like what tends to happen is when it is their friends that told them that
Uh-huh.
something was wrong.
Right.
So I feel like some education.
Which really ties nicely back to your comment. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like it's less likely that students feel like they need to change their narrative to like not disappoint their friends or whatever. I don't know if that's what she was saying, but oftentimes students come in and they say like, I didn't really realize what was wrong. We were more in that denial phase, and then my friend told me that was what's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes that feels really supportive. And sometimes not so much, to have someone else define your experience of anything. Back to that point. Let me see if we loop to that eventually. I want to broaden the conversation slightly and just talk a bit about impact, and then I'm going to broaden it one step even further. So I think, it's important to just ground the conversation in why this is important, whether we're talking about small daily slights or whether we're talking about sexual violence. I very much believe that betrayal in this way affects all the things up on the screen in lots of ways. So again, people that have heard me talk at UCSB have heard me talk about the developmental milestones in college and how, when you think about achieving competence, managing emotions, becoming autonomous, establishing identity, finding out what freeing interpersonal relationships are like, and clarifying purpose or meaning. Like, those are the main things that we think of when we think of emerging adulthood and college students. And, trauma with a little t over time, or trauma with a big T, I feel like this type of betrayal trauma disrupts all of that. So really creates disorientation, easy distractibility, a lack of focus. In terms of emotions, you think about emotions becoming so much more all over the place and unpredictable for people. So fear, grief, irritability, anxiety, panic, anger, and not being able to know when that is going to change for them. And then the idea of becoming autonomous, we think about feeling dependent or withdrawing. So oftentimes after interpersonal betrayal, you either want to make sure that you have your people and really solidify that, and you can actually, I see friends all the time that are like, whoa, this person needs to back off. It becomes kind of intense. Or the opposite, you see survivors withdraw and really kind of move away from those relationships. And then in terms of establishing identity, loss of belief system, meaning, loss of trust, detachment, lots of sense of order in the world. And when you think about these betrayals that we all stood up for at the beginning of the session, when we think of those happening over and over and over again in our lives, maybe having something really intense like what we're talking about in this case example, or maybe not, I think about how that impacts all of us and our reactions to all of these things we're talking about. Psychological, this is probably where most of the people in the room are comfortable with how trauma impacts, but oftentimes we see increased depression, anxiety. Oftentimes it shows up in sort of sometimes random phobias, OCD, social anxiety for sure, panic. I see it diagnosed a lot as ADHD. It's a little pet peeve. You can talk to me after if you want to talk about that. But concentration issues, and then of course we have the normal PTSD, nightmares, and flashbacks. And then I think it's important to just talk about physical. We're talking chronic pain, gastro stuff, urinary tract infections, painful intercourse, which people don't talk about enough after trauma, migraines and other frequent headaches, STIs, cervical cancer, genital injuries, appetite. I didn't mention eating disorders in the last one, but. And then we have all the environmental impacts, and I put up a modified version of the care wheel up there, which has just all the ways that these experiences impact all of us, I would argue, by affecting us financially. If you think about employment opportunities, housing, safety, medical exams, possibly reporting or wrestling with that, academic or work effects that it has, not to mention emotional. So, any other major effects that you see with your clients or in other ways that you want to name? That was a very quick overview. Yes. Yeah. lots of different issues. What I'll say on a large level, culture aside for a second, and then I'll get back to that piece, is that, I would say, looking at my advocates, like 90% of survivors I talk to are like, I don't know if I want to do this because I don't want to ruin his life, or I know I'm using male pronouns, but I don't want to destroy this person. I want maybe them to get in like a little trouble, but not like too much trouble, and how do I control that? So I think at a broader level, that plays into something that I think is part of the experience of this betrayal that we're talking about. But you also brought up, there's actually someone under Jennifer Fried at University of Oregon working on cultural betrayal trauma, which is more specific than it sounds. It's actually about that, about not wanting to report a perpetrator in the same minority group as yourself, and the extra layer of betrayal and confusion that comes with trying to know how to navigate that. And I've actually had discussions, and I lead the Healing After Sexual Assault group, and I've had discussions where literally everyone ran around and said the privilege status of their perpetrator and how that made them more likely to report or not, like in a circle, out loud. So I think it's a real thing, and I think it's a thing that people do think about and wrestle with. Does anyone have any thoughts that they want to add to that? Because I think that's sort of another side but large issue. Yeah.
On the other side of that is that for a lot of communities that have not felt supported by law enforcement
Right.
or the justice system historically and have felt betrayed by that system,
Absolutely.
perpetrator identity aside, that may not be an option for them.
Right.
So when people are presenting that as an option for healing or gaining some kind of justice or rightness out of the experience,
Right.
that may not be an option.
Right. Yes. And that's maybe even more undocumented status, and just historical experiences with law enforcement. And yeah, right now, as I'm traumatized and I'm going to go talk to a law enforcement officer, like in this moment, which actually, unless someone has something burning to say, leads me to my next. Okay. So, institutional betrayal. We've touched on it, but I just want to go out to this layer. So I would like I'll read the questions out loud, but then I'd like for you to get maybe with your table or the person next to you and hear your thoughts on these questions. So how might the experience of being betrayed by a system, so say a university, or an organization of authority, say police, be similar or different to the individual betrayal we've been talking about? How might attachment, betrayal, entrapment, immobility, or the shattered sense of trust apply to institutional betrayal? And how does this change based on cultural identities and or historical oppression or mistrust? So just get with the people next to you and have a few minutes, and then we'll come back together.
Send them white when they talk because it's really hard to pick up this in.
Got it. Okay. Perfect. I will.
too, to have faith that that home is going to protect you, I think is really high.
It's creamy.
Oh my God.
Uh-oh.
I'm just gonna tell you guys that.
Breathe, Callie, that's like so painful. Oh my god.
What institution are you from?
UCLA.
Thank you for sitting in front.
I also think that there's this other piece of
Okay, maybe take one more minute to finish up your thought. Okay. So who had gems in their group that they want to share? Oh, good. I've been told to give people the microphones. I apologize, but
we were talking about how if you go through an initial trauma and then you decide to go ahead and report to your institution or law enforcement agency, that it takes so much courage to do that next step, and then if you feel betrayed by that institution, it's like a double injury happening because you already had the initial trauma, and then if your university or law enforcement agency doesn't support you, are you feel unsupported by that, it's pouring salt in the wound, and it's just a double injury to what the initial trauma was.
absolutely. Thank you for starting us off. Yeah, and I can't even add to that enough or magnify that enough that I feel like the attachment piece is what makes interpersonal violence so difficult, but it's also a protective factor because the attachment is like a meaning-making source. And sometimes with institutions, that's not there. And so all the harbored trauma that's inside of you that you've been sort of trying to figure out how to make meaning of in your mind all comes to bear when you feel betrayed by a system that you're not in a relationship with as directly. So I see it being really, really oftentimes where the trauma even becomes worse. Yeah.
I think it's where you can find that somebody who is resilient by nature or have strong attachments, which is what contributes to higher self-esteem and higher confidence, that when they're put through something like this, they can then develop learned helplessness, and they can then no longer be as resilient. And now you've gotten somebody who was at their A game is now gone down. Because when you think about police or institutional betrayal, that is the higher power that you're supposed to look to. That's where you think that you have some, that you have some say, somebody is going to protect you, and then that's who actually cuts the feet from under you. Then now like there's no control, there's nothing I can do that can make anything different. And so you might find that somebody who was resilient no longer is.
Absolutely. So it's like the last ditch effort at feeling some control and agency in the situation. And if that's another betrayal, then it kind of goes back to Mario's kind of feeling like this kind of hopelessness. It's like now I don't trust this group of people and I don't trust the people who are supposed to help me.
I just wanted to focus on another part, which is the burden of proof is on the victim. To me, that just the process of reporting the crime, the anxiety I see in my students, it's almost like you'd rather would not go through the process. So I think that in itself is the re-traumatizing them.
Absolutely. It goes back to, who was the comment about we already know what they're going to say about blaming us, right? So this process of reporting is pretty hellish. And so not only do you have to remember every moment, but you have to prove. You have to prove it. You have to prove why you're not. And you're already wrestling with all the things we were talking about that we all feel all the time, of already the shame and disgust and confusion, and then now you're responsible for convincing an authority figure that you might not trust anyway, why all those things aren't true. It's a It's a horrible position to be in. Yeah.
I was just going to add that I think, in thinking about the expectation piece with attachment and betrayal, that, many students would have different expectations of making a report to the police and expecting that to be negative, or, maybe feeling like a criminal, and making a report to the university. That the university is also their home and identity, and being a student there, and the expectation that a university is supposed to care about their welfare and protect them. So when they feel they're not getting that response, like how that can feel like a different sort of attachment betrayal than making a report to the police.
How many people have worked with a survivor that the presenting concern that they came in with is a friend didn't believe them? I don't know how many people have worked with survivors, but okay. So I find that being one of the most common initial issues. It's not the assault we're talking about first, it's the fact that someone didn't believe them. Now you take that and you decide that the police don't believe you or the university doesn't believe you. That's like, yeah. Pauline. Okay. So I'd like to shift this slightly into what's our role in this? So we have a room full of people that work at a university and are authority figures. How do you all see yourself related to this question? How did you all come up in your own discussions?
I think we all run the risk of betraying our students. So I think a lot of the work that we have to do is owning that and not being defensive about that, and recognizing that even really well-intentioned, caring helper healers can add to that betrayal. And the first sign of that is recognizing it and being aware, and how to prevent that.
Does that cause anxiety for anyone?
I think it's also really important to recognize as a therapist what identities you have that mimic the identity of the oppressor, whether you be white, a male, or, it needs to be addressed. And I think, talking about institutional betrayal and the systems that we have to work within, well, can we address that in 3 to 4 sessions? And it's, these are the challenges that we're faced when we're having to try to support these students. It's pretty tough.
3 to 4 sessions in of itself could feel like a betrayal, right? Yeah.
I guess I think I'm thinking more so with my heart right now because it's beating, and I think there's many reasons that it could be beating quite heavily at this moment. And I also notice that cognitively I'm having a hard time connecting the dots, and so I'm like, help me, help me. Well, I think there's a variety of reasons why there's some confusion. But in terms of the topic of betrayal, for me, I'm thinking about also the young man. He's our child. Both of them are our children. And I'm thinking just about how, just as a system, we are betraying our children when these things occur. So I'm also thinking about him. And so I'm thinking about your role, or our roles as well. How do you hold in these conversations, meeting them where they are at, and also culturally sensitive, competent psychoeducation?
You. Okay, so let me try to answer that, and then I want to keep this conversation going that just started. So I want everyone to hold that while I hold how I deal with both those things. Okay, great. She's holding it for me. So I think meeting someone where they're at in therapy is the most vital thing we do, trauma or not trauma. But I think it's easily missed when it comes to trauma because we have lots of assumptions about trauma. We also have a lot of fear about trauma, and I think we're getting to one of them, right? Like, oh shit, like, am I gonna mess this up? Am I gonna be another person that's gonna disappoint or betray them? And so we start spinning. And so I think it's easy to jump to try to solve problems, to try to inform the person that what they've just been through is awful and horrific. I think it's easy to jump to dismissing it, not in overt ways, hopefully, but in like, I'm scared and this feels really big and we only have 3 sessions ways. So I think I keep all those things in mind and really try to listen very carefully to what brought the person in and where they're at in this moment. And how can we tie that to the experience of betrayal? How can we tie it to other experiences they've had in their life of betrayal, which is, I think, where the cultural competence comes in one way for me, of historical experiences of being marginalized or feeling silenced throughout their life, and that this could be a trigger. I see that a lot. I see that the trauma that someone walks in with is a trigger for a whole host of experiences of betrayal and pieces of identity that need to be heard and need to be honored and listened to. So I do a lot of psychoeducation, but I do a lot of psychoeducation that's not telling people how they're supposed to feel. So stuff around neurobiology and common reactions, and I listen to what their reaction was, and then I tell them how common that is, which is always true. So things like that. I'm not sure if I'm starting to get at the bigness of your question, but I'd love to hear how other people weave in not making assumptions, cultural competence into their work, and back into this piece of how we, as an institution, cannot replicate betrayal. So other thoughts on that? There were other hands.
Oh, great, awesome. I think a lot about how I use language and just the power of words, and not just words, just even nonverbal language and other kinds of expressive language and communication, and how important it is in every moment to remember my power and the power of language, and how important it is to give that back, and to make the dialogue be one that is always giving back the power and always hopefully empowering my client again, anew. That's one of the ways that I think about working with IPD survivors.
Great. So talking about giving back the power, and I oftentimes name that. Give people choice about where they want to sit, what the pacing of the session is going to be, when it's going to end, and go ahead and name those things, and name why it's important in this moment. You've had a lot of choice and agency taken away from you in the last week. Like, let's try to figure out how this session can feel like you're more in control. Other thoughts? Yeah.
As in sometimes students are coming in and it's because of something that's happening outside there and there's nobody else to turn to. So can we then come out of our comfort zone, which would sometimes mean going up against administration, rules and regulations, to try to see what we can do to help the student or give the student agency through power that we have as the therapist. But sometimes you get this feeling that no, you know what, you need to stay in your lane and you just listen and you don't act. But can we actually notice when we can act and what we can do? And it might be uncomfortable, and it also might trigger some kind of backlash for us, but is that something we're willing to do for the students?
Awesome. Can all the care advocates in the room just stand up? Come on. Thank you. So, this is what some people on our campus are dealing with every day. But you make a really great point as a therapist, because it is comfortable and simpler to stay in our lane. And how are we articulating another quiet betrayal by doing that? What are we saying to someone when they're telling us that someone in the university has wronged them again, and we're listening very empathetically? And we are employed by that university, right? So I think it's a brilliant question, and I don't have a simple answer to it. If anyone else has any answers to it, I think it's difficult. Yeah. Yeah. talking about is gray. Let's not pretend it's not gray. It's gray. I think, us being employees of the university and then going and advocating for our clients against something the university is doing has a lot of things that are complicated about it. So it might be in our ethical guidelines. That does not make it simple. So yeah, I think it's an important conversation, and I think it's an important thing for us thinking about all the time, especially when it comes to multicultural competence or being trauma informed, of how are we enacting avoidance or silence in our designated role as a 50-minute session. I saw there was, okay.
I think we have to be really careful how we define what happens, with a student's trauma, because when you think of cultural identity, the Native American community, there's like an epidemic of rape of young women and sexual assault. And if you try to push your agenda too quickly, it's almost kind of similar to domestic violence, when you're trying to say, you need to leave that person, you need to do this, and you need to do that. And it's like, it's way more complicated than that. And if you're trying to tell a person that, oh, this is horrible, you need to report, and they're looking at their entire environment is experiencing this, and it's like, my whole race and culture is being destroyed, and that could be extremely traumatic. Or, they have some family dynamic issues in certain other cultures where it's very paternalistic, and there's a lot of, very closed systems, and I think we have to be very careful. We have to be aware of what our beliefs are, and if we're subconsciously kind of pushing the agenda on them. And especially if someone is just, I had an incident where a student came to see me. She was seeing another therapist, and she mentioned that she had this kind of date rape scenario, but she was kind of okay about it, kind of processing it, what happened. And when she told the therapist, they're like, you were assaulted, you were raped, you need to report this. And she said she just fell apart after that. And she had such a shattered sense of self and couldn't put herself back together, and has been in treatment ever since. And it's like, sometimes I think the body is prepared to repair itself. Like, we have the natural ability to overcome trauma, and sometimes we need to let that natural process begin and take over. But if we intercept it and we got to do something, interventions, we got to advocate, sometimes that causes more trauma than we would have liked.
Thank you. That was really well said.
It just makes me think that there's a lot of richness to process in the fantasies that they have and the desires and the wishes that they have for what we would do, and without actually doing anything.
Great. Yeah.
Sort of an answer to your question a little bit of, can we step out of our offices and advocate and do things? I think we can. I think we should. I think that you might want to talk to your director. There's ways of doing it and ways of not doing it. And when we can advocate for the system, not the individual also. So we can advocate around interpersonal violence, sexual assault. What are we doing? How are we educating? There was a time when I found out, I just kept hearing stories about a particular department. And so without talking about any individual, I found a way to talk to someone who could talk to that department or investigate, look into what's going on. So I think those are the ways, without betraying any individual trust, or talk about an individual client. But certainly if you see systemic things going on, there has to be people on your campus you can talk to in a hypothetical way, just in finding ways to do that. But I think I could never remain a therapist if I couldn't also do prevention work, go out and do workshops. There's just so many ways you can be part of the solution, and it may not be for your individual client, but indirectly it is, because we're looking at the whole system and doing prevention and intervention.
Another aspect that I always have to advocate is around the mental health impact of trauma. Like you're saying, the cognitive slowing, the distractibility, unable to keep up with their classes and assignments. And that's one area that I really get frustrated that unfortunately the faculty has, they might say they understand it, but they have no comprehension what it really means and how trauma impacts. So I wish university would be doing something about educating the academic staff and faculty around it.
One of the next slides is our commitment to each other, so maybe a PowerPoint is coming for you. Okay, we opened up lots of different, which is great. I love it. This is what I wanted. Any burning thoughts before I open up some other questions? Okay. And I think we have like 15-ish minutes, so I'm going to do one more discussion question, and then I'm happy to field questions too about anything, loose ends. So really quick, take a deep breath and turn to your neighbor again. And this is going to be even shorter, but I'd like you to talk about how do we think daily slights, so the ones we maybe were talking about more at the beginning or kind of the ongoing experiences, impact people over time. I'm wondering if you think people become more sensitized or desensitized to interpersonal betrayal over time, and then how lifelong experiences of betrayal or marginalization might impact someone's response to one of these larger traumas that we're talking about. Okay? Okay, take one last minute to finish your thought. Okay. So I was at Thanksgiving this year, and I was making small talk with a 70-year-old man. And then he told me he wanted to get me drunk and show me something sparkly. I don't really know what that means. But I had this moment, I already made this PowerPoint, and I had this moment where I thought, at what point in my life am I going to start responding to these things differently? So that was kind of my thought behind this question, is everyone in the room has dealt with daily slights in one form or another, or maybe multiple. I'm wondering what you all think. What happens as we go through life with these? Sensitized, desensitized, impact? Both. Can you flesh it out?
We just said that it kind of depends on people's coping style, and kind of related to the second piece, if you grow up with constant boundary violations, it could start to feel normal, and so you don't notice it, which would be desensitized. And then as you gain awareness, we were saying, like, you come to college, you learn about microaggressions, maybe you become more sensitized to it. So, yeah.
Like the developmental piece, or maybe different phases of life bring out different pieces too.
Not so much my group, more me, but I think I think over time you become like sort of more used to it, like to being slighted sometimes, or it's like less surprising maybe. And I think sometimes you pick your battles, kind of sometimes based on your mood or your sort of confrontation style. But I like to think like the more and more it builds up, like you're kind of less likely to like let the 7-year-old man make the comment. Like you're like, okay, what point like is this going to stop? You know, and I think it gets old after a while, and somewhat less surprising, but I think more irritating. And like in my own life, you know, I hear people make like homophobic remarks or transphobic remarks, and it just gets like old. But some days I'm like, you know, I'm tired of fighting the battle. Like I'm tired of like correcting people. But other days I'm like, no, this is important, you know. So I think it kind of depends, kind of on you and your style. But
So I'm hearing style, maybe personality, maybe developmental period, what you're learning, and then also maybe like how much energy you have that day, whether you're getting a cold. What are other people's thoughts? Yeah.
Our group pretty much agrees with everything that's been said, but I wanted to add the piece that we were also talking about. Some people can't step out of that. I can't step out of my black skin. So it happens, and some days I'll not respond to it, and some days I will respond to it, whether it's energy or effort, too much effort, or whatever, or who it is. But some people can't get away from that, and it's not just the slight of a 7-year-old man saying something. It's, you know, we went to microaggressions pretty quickly, but that's not a slight. It means a slight, but they don't mean it. But how are you going to deal with it? So we think it's both sensitized and desensitized.
Constant flow, inescapability. Got it. Yeah.
I think just to add to that, one of the things that we highlighted was the protective quality that sometimes come from being in a desensitized space, because we're talking about slights. You know, they're not built to be sustaining and to be empowering. They're things that have the potential to damage us emotionally, psychologically, and oftentimes physically. And I think when you are dealing with something like that on a reoccurring basis, being desensitized can almost be like a protective factor and allow you to kind of have a way of coping with things so that you are protecting yourself from some of this potential damage that can occur when these things happen.
That was one of the things I was hoping to get to, so thank you. Yeah.
This might be slightly off the topic, but just on the marginalization and desensitization, I want to bring focus on yanking of hijabs. And we have heard that, like in Michigan recently, a girl was set on fire. One incident, the hijab was yanked so hard that she almost choked, the girl almost choked, pushing of girls and all that. And I and few of the mental health providers are trying to bring it under the laws of sexual assault. But I do feel there is this desensitization, or I can't even say it's apathy, but there's not that much reaction to it that there should be. So just wanted to bring that out.
Any last thoughts or group reactions? Okay. let's talk about what we want to take away. And so we've talked a little bit about how the topics relate to your day-to-day work. I'm wondering what we want to commit to. Is there anything you want to commit to as service providers to allow maybe pieces of our conversation today to inform your work not only with survivors of sexual assault, but survivors of isms, of the ongoing issues that we're talking about? Does anyone have any idea? I heard a couple ideas as we've been talking of training faculty. Anyone have any kind of thoughts that have come to them while we've been here in terms of takeaways, things you could do differently or apply, or action you could take? Yeah.
Not letting fear allow us to kind of contribute to, another type of institutionalized betrayal, and not worrying about not having enough time, but being able to, someone over here said something about just like explore more about what someone really, not problem solve like we want to do in our 3 to 4 sessions, but really just be with someone in the moment and not feel like a pressure to do something, and also not be afraid to really go into some of the deeper, scary stuff. That's my commitment, and hopefully you'll help me out with that.
That's a great commitment. Thank you for naming it.
I think one of the takeaways is what you were saying about getting out of our offices and advocating with different units. Like, I feel like, financial aid, academic accommodations, all of these things we don't necessarily jump to right away, but are appropriate in many, many situations. And even the delivery model that we give student services is not always culturally congruent. There are things that make people feel unwelcome. I mean, all of that, just keeping our eyes out for that on a constant basis, and being the voice of change within our institutions.
I feel like our institutions have to help us a little bit more, and keep us a little bit more informed and communicated with as to what are the policies, what are the protocols, what are the expectations on staff, just to give us a better idea of, there's a lot of risk management, there's a lot of liability, there's all these sort of, ogres out there, and yet we're in the trenches doing the work, and we don't always know what's going on a higher level in the institution. So I think some more regular communication about what the university is doing, and what the expectations are of us, and the pathways to communication, because these things tend to change pretty quickly, and the university takes different paths, and so I think they have whoever they are, have a responsibility to help us do our work better.
Thank you. I think they're also, so we're talking here about clients, but we're also talking about ourselves and our experiences. And so with that, a commitment to take care of ourselves, both in terms of getting support when we are triggered, but also support in working together and not being alone in this advocacy and this work that we're all doing.
I feel like we should be instituting some snaps.
I feel that our institutions are doing a lot of, I'm going to call it post work, after an event happens, and we should be taking a look at what we're doing before these students get on campus. The gentleman that was in our group talked about we should get rid of all fraternities because there's signs that are up, bring your daughters to us, when people are moving in on move-in day. And the thought that runs through my head is not to get rid of all fraternities, I'm not voting for that, but what are we really doing that's intensive before these students get here, or within those first 3 weeks that we know that those first-year students are at a high risk? Right now, I know what we do on our campus is, I think we all have the UCOP directives, so the letter goes out from the chancellor. We have something in our orientation, but it is not enough. We really need some type of accredited, longer-term, pre-come-to-college course that takes this very seriously, and it really is before they step onto campus. It really is a requirement of life. that when you get here, our expectation of community standards is you know this. And as a young man, a young woman, however you identify on the spectrum, you're aware of the fact that this is the culture that you're stepping into. This is the culture we're trying to change. These are the things that you can do to be empowered yourself as a person, to do the right things. And whether that be the bystander training or you yourself internalizing those methods of operating within the campus. I just feel like we're taking little stabs at it. We need to do a lot more of the pre-work before they get here, because we're putting all this time. Our care advocates are wonderful. Our care office is wonderful. I just think about if we could put much more effort into before they get here and when they first are here, more intensive work, how that would change the culture that we're looking at.
So are you signing up for? I didn't mean to make light of it. I love the spirit behind the prevention and getting it at the beginning, because you're so right.
So I think I commit to doing more advocacy through listening. I think I've had a lot of questions or a lot of things I wanted to comment on today. But I also recognize there's advocacy in being able to listen more. And I also think that as a man, being able to call out more of the bullshit in the circles that I run, whether that's with other black men or with my fraternity, to actually call it out, because I think there's power in that and it's necessary.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Yeah. Any other commitments, takeaways? Well, those were wonderful ones, and you all have been amazing. We have a few minutes. If anyone has any questions or any thoughts that they didn't feel like they were able to share that they would like to put out there. Yeah. Okay. So trauma-informed care and something that's more adaptable and that we can all lean on each other. Any other thoughts or questions? We have lots of wisdom in the room too if people have questions for each other. Care advocates, therapists, directors, psychiatrists. You all have cocktail hour on the brain, as do I. Thank you all so much for your participation. That was really, really lovely. Thank you.
I hope he doesn't have a Zoom. Oh, good job. Should we stand? Just be and here's the learning objectives. You can read them themselves. Okay. So these are the learning objectives that I don't like to read from a slide anyway, so you can just be oh, and here's if you want to.
Okay. Hi, I haven't seen you all morning.
I know, I didn't want to disrupt, but debating this one on reduction students. Do you feel like there's stuff here that okay. I just want to make sure I wasn't going to miss something I haven't heard or seen. Okay. you're going to introduce us, or you want us to introduce ourselves? Okay. I feel weird doing that sitting down, but that's okay.
Okay, I think we're going to get started. Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to have this hour to be able to discuss the emerging, what I hope is a trend in the UC campuses and hopefully nationally, to have trauma-focused psychologists or therapists in the collaborative environment of us all working to address trauma on university campuses. So I'm going to have us do more thorough introductions in a minute, but to start, I'd like to just have us introduce ourselves and where we're coming from. So my name is Callie Lantrip, and I'm a psychologist at UCSB, and currently the interpersonal violence specialist, which I will be explaining what that means, but I'll let the rest of you introduce yourself.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. I'm Louisa Ladd, and I am a trauma-focused staff psychologist at UC Santa Cruz, newly hired, just recently finished my postdoc at UC Davis, internship and postdoc at UC Davis. Welcome.
Hi, good morning. My name is Mandy Mount, and I am standing in for Lisa Lim along with my colleague.
I'm Frances Diaz.
And I'm a counseling psychologist. I'm also the director of UC Irvine's Care Office. So for our trauma-focused postdoc fellow, I am one of the two supervisors and providing the financial support for the position.
And I am Frances Diaz. I am the Associate Director and Training Director at UC Irvine's Counseling Center. I am a licensed psychologist, and I am currently the supervisor for the postdoc for this particular collaboration that's happening with our care office. And since Dr. Lim isn't able to be here today, the two of us are going to do our best to try and represent one of her and what she does.
Which is pretty appropriate. Yeah. It's actually really appropriate, because one of the things we'll be talking about is how we live in both worlds of the care advocacy world and as well as the counseling and psychological services world. So we've represented one person with two, which is, yeah, maybe appropriate to what we're dealing with. So I want to just start with kind of introducing where this idea came from and kind of what's happening nationally and in the UC environment. So I'm guessing that all of you are here because you have some interest in this work or have some knowledge of what's happening across the country and at our individual campuses. But in the last, I guess I could say 20 years and then 10 years and then 5 years, but I would say in the last 2 years, there has been a really big shift in feeling like universities need to be paying a lot of attention and careful attention to addressing the needs of survivors on our campus. There's definitely a new federal level attention being paid to laws and regulations and governance around these issues that's come from a lot of feedback that universities have gotten for, sweeping things under the rug or not taking care of student survivors in the way that feels trauma-informed or trauma-centered. So out of that movement, which has lots of different pieces, there's been a shift in kind of UC mandate, and a lot of that's come from the top and come down, and it's included changes in every part of this process on our campuses. And there's a lot of experts in the room in addition to us, so we can touch on those things if people have questions. But what I wanted to say is that, the adjudication process, the investigation process, the support and how we collaborate on campus, all of that has had new requirements and new mandates for us as university personnel that I think has informed a larger, maybe anxiety in some ways, as well as in created more complexity to the way that we collaborate and work together on these issues, but has also really been helpful in kind of putting a lens on trauma-informed care and how are we meeting the needs of diverse range of student survivors. So within that, about 1.5 years ago, the UCSB chancellor was asked what he could do to help with interpersonal violence on campus, and the people that were in the room said, we need a psychologist focused on this, and so a new career position was born, and so I got hired into that role summer before last. And so in the last 1.5 years, what I've really been focused on is how do we change the model of therapy, how do we change the model of training on campus, and how do we change the model of collaborating with each other so that we're really working as a tight-knit group to support survivors and make sure that people aren't falling through the cracks. So I will also just kind of say at a broad level, and we'll be speaking to this in lots of different ways, that I do feel like there historically has been a way that departments have been siloed around these issues. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. One of the reasons is confidentiality. So I feel like CAPS is really comfortable staying in our bubble and really only seeing the people we see and not really talking to people, unless we have the proper release and there's a reason. And I know that, and I can let others speak to this, but I know that CARE comes from a very a similar traditional model of really protecting the confidentiality of their clients, sometimes in a way that gets in the way of collaborating and making that more smooth transition between departments. So I think one of the things that I'd like us to talk about and explore with all of your campuses and how we can move forward is how do we break down some of those walls in ways that are still confidential and really respecting, the needs of each student, and also allowing us to work together. And there's another piece to that, which is that this work is really lonely and isolating and heavy. And so how do we support each other and allow the heaviness to be okay and spoken to and be in the work together rather than feeling like we all have to kind of stay in our corner. So I'm gonna start with just talking a little bit about UCSB and what I do in my role, and then each of them are going to mirror that. And then what I really would like to do, we have 45 minutes together. I'd really like to hear from you all questions, thoughts, things that you feel like are gaps from your programs that maybe you see up here and you either are wondering how that's happening or how we've built that, or wondering if there's ways to do it better. For us all to be kind of working together to figure out how we can to spread this and grow this and what's our vision as a whole. So at UCSB, I have lots of different roles, and that's always interesting to balance, as I know all of you know. So I'll start with the clinical work, which is down on the bottom left, but I hold probably a smaller caseload than most of our staff psychologists, but it's still a large one. And it's 100% trauma. So my referrals are coming from either other CAPS clinicians, they're coming from the care advocates, they're coming from other people on campus, so psychiatry, medical, other referrals like that. And I hold them usually a bit longer than the average kind of turnover that we have at CAPS. In addition to that, currently I lead one healing after sexual assault group. At UCSB, we have currently seven, I think, trauma-focused groups that we lead. So 4 of those or 5 of those are kind of traditional support groups. We also have yoga as healing.
For recovery?
There's different names for it. Oh. But we have a yoga as healing group, and that's yoga focused for trauma survivors. And we also have a drum circle for survivors and allies. So we've been trying to find ways to do more nonverbal healing and kind of have more cultural inclusivity in that. So that's the clinical piece. Going over to the right, one of the things that we've changed at UCSB is that there was some disjointed aspects of how survivors in other offices were getting risk assessments. So we've sort of streamlined that process, and I have tried to make myself as available as possible or able to be pulled out of things to provide suicide risk assessments for survivors if they're in the care offices or in other areas of campus, in order to have them not feel like they're having multiple points of contact and or not having trauma-sensitive assessments done. Along with that and related is I have an hour and a half with the care advocates every week, where I do some basic sort of case management. I operate as a consultant, so I'm in there, informed consent. And then I also provide some clinical supervision around, like, again, the heaviness of this work, the intensity of it, what are some reactions that are coming up for us, and how can we be real with each other around that and move through them. I work doing a lot of education, prevention, and trainings for staff and students. So doing trainings on betrayal trauma, how to work with students, how to not replicate experiences of betrayal, how to deal with the anxiety of the spotlight on this issue. So available for informal consultations and trainings in that way, but also I do formal presentations. A big part of my work, I lean heavily on the care office to help me with this, but a big part of my work and what I see as being really important is that campus partners know me and that I'm involved in the different discussions that are happening across campus, whether it be Title IX, judicial, housing, student health. And I've done that in different ways. When I first got the position, I did individual meetings with everyone. And as I've gone on, it's been more kind of just informal, kind of trying to stay in the loop and stay in the conversation and have it be trauma relevant services be present in those conversations. I also lead a weekly 1-hour CAPS consultation group for the psychologists at CAPS that are focused on this work. So actually who's in the group are all of our group leaders. And it's an amazing, dedicated group of people that feel passionate about working with trauma and are available for my referrals, care referrals, other referrals from campus. So that also adds to the feeling of not being alone and being able to consult on really difficult cases, stay up to date with best practices, that sort of thing. And we, every other week, invite all of our CAPS clinicians to drop into that if they have a consultation that they would like support with. And lastly, or maybe firstly, I feel like a big part of my role is to be learning the ever-changing policy and being able to report back to CAPS, but also just to be available for consultation around that. And I think we probably all agree that it can feel like we're drowning in that because it's constantly changing and evolving. So I'm going to pause there and have Louisa talk about UC Santa Cruz.
Sounds good, thank you. And I'm just going to do it from here. I'm really comfy in my seat here. So yeah, it's really nice to hear and very informative to hear what you're doing and to be able to kind of compare the differences and see what you're doing kind of as like a framework, because we're really new in this. This is month 3 of kind of building this up. So this is kind of what I've been doing so far, and then a little bit about where I'm hoping to go in the future. So this position is called a trauma-focused therapist. So I really see my role as someone who is comfortable and confident in trauma-informed work and can serve as a consultant to both CAPS and CARE in whatever they need. So just from the, I'm not going to go in any particular order, but just from the case consultation and kind of collaboration role, that's really kind of where I'm starting from. And that does bring up, as you said, a lot of concerns about confidentiality and things, processes that we're always trying to work through. Some of the things that we've done to kind of help that has been, I'm also in their informed consent, so they can, CARE can share with me a lot of information. And then one of the things we started routinely including in intakes, when I do an intake, is having them sign an ROI generally so that I can speak with CARE if that's needed. So that's something that we've done. I too heavily rely upon CARE for a lot of things, such as learning the policies and kind of legal aspects. I'm kind of learning while doing. We do have an hour. I'm thinking I should ask for an hour and a half too now. We have an hour case consultation that I kind of just joined in on, so I've had to learn a lot because they're already consulting about cases. So I've kind of hung back a little bit and tried to bring value where I can, but I think it is a little bit short now that we're adding me into it.
Is this technically an hour?
Okay. So yeah, that's one aspect of it. So another thing that I rely on, they have done most of the liaisons with the different campus partners, and I think they had as far as I can tell, have already had a pretty good established relationship with CAPS. So they had identified providers that they knew were kind of allies for trauma work, and that they were already referring to. So I'm kind of seeing my role as bolstering that. They also have a dedicated violence prevention and education coordinator. So there's someone in the office that does that full time. So I'm not necessarily doing that, but I do offer kind of like self-care trainings and those types of things for the CARE staff. So the CARE staff actually has a student staff. So we have retreats. I think of myself as a consultant in that role as well. So might do a training on self-care, might lead some mindfulness exercises, and I do attend their staff meeting. every week, and so I'm part of 2 teams. But I do feel very thankful that we have like a dedicated person, and because that's like having 2 jobs. So obviously I'm always available for crisis response and any sort of like case management. In terms of crises, I'm maybe not as easily pulled out into different places. For intense crises, we like those to happen in the central office because UC Santa Cruz is decentralized, so I'm kind of out in my little tree house in the middle of nowhere, so it's not the best place to have a crisis. So but I am available, but no like drop in, and we can talk a little bit more about structure with the next bubble, which is my clinical work. So far I'm doing intakes and I'm doing individual therapy. The way that it's worked out so far, I don't have 100% trauma. I do about 3 intakes a week, and one of them is kind of left open for general, and the other 2 I kind of hold or add as needed that are specific assault, sorry, my back's to you all, referrals. So, and those referrals come from anywhere. They come from care, they come from psychiatry, they might come from another therapist. So that's pretty much it. And then for the groups, we are definitely hoping to build some groups. One of the things that we will be doing, hopefully in February, will be a yoga, I think ours is called Yoga for Recovery group. And we're still working on it, but part of my role will be to kind of help support that, maybe even be part of the group, and also do like screenings for the group as well. So, and then hopefully grow that part of our programming. Yeah, I think that's, one thing I didn't mention is in terms of campus partners, one hope that I have is to be able to really get to know some of the off-campus referrals and understand who does feel comfortable off campus, and not just who says they're comfortable doing trauma work, but actually have a relationship with some of these off-campus providers to see if we can build some relationships there and have a better understanding, just to have more support in the community. So that's kind of like a future goal. That's pretty much it. Thank you.
So I'm gonna start speaking for Lisa. That's Lisa. We have a picture so that she can be present. She's really sad that she's not able to be here. Lisa is housed in our CAPS. She's part of CAPS. She's fully operational out of our CAPS. And so her clinical work isn't 100% trauma focused. It's about 2/3 trauma focused. She does all of the other things that all the other postdocs do, and so we're really fortunate on that. I oversee, right now I'm overseeing 100% of her clinical work, but that's going to be transitioning soon to one of our other senior staff psychologists who has a trauma interest and expertise, and so she will also be taking on some of the supervision, so that'll help around that. Lisa also serves as, in collaboration with our staff psychologist, Dr. Dorsheimer, as the liaison to the care office. So it's really important because then she's able to be present for a lot of the meetings and help make sure that we're getting informed about some of the latest policies and practices that might be happening on our campus or nationally that we need to make sure are getting informed into our service delivery. And so she's really good about bringing that back to our staff. And then in addition to that, she does provide education and training specifically to our trainees, but also to our staff. She's going to be helping to develop some of our training for just sort of in services for our staff, to make sure that our staff, because as generalists, we do want to continue to be able to provide support for students regardless. They don't always walk in the door to care first. Sometimes they walk into our doors first, and we want to make sure that we're creating a bridge between those 2 departments so that these students are having as much support and comprehensive care as possible. She also is in the process of, she does a lot in terms of the holistic healing programs, which I'm going to have Dr. Mount talk a little bit more about the details of that. But we work really closely to make sure that, because she's one person and she still needs her training, that she's having enough time to breathe. And I think that's partly why we haven't moved into 100% trauma-focused treatment, because I also think that it's important for her to be able to, because of the heaviness and the intensity of some of the work that she's doing, every once in a while we need, and not that the other students aren't intense and heavy, but to have a little bit of balance and sort of pull away from that every now and then. And so we've talked about that and sort of how to configure her clinical load so that she's getting a nice balance around that. The other thing that I'll say before I hand it over to Dr. Mount is out of the care office, they do have a peer program. It's the Right to Know peer program, and our interns have typically been able to be involved as sort of a supervisor to that peer-to-peer program. And so this year, Lisa's also getting an opportunity to dabble a little bit in supervision. So she's overseeing our intern and working with Mandy on that, and I'll let Mandy talk about that so that we can help develop her supervision skills and abilities around that.
Thanks. So I'll just jump in with a couple of the pieces that Francis mentioned about the holistic healing work that Dr. Lim is doing. So one of the things that's really important to us, and maybe we can expand upon in a little bit when we talk about culturally competent service delivery, is providing holistic opportunities for healing and multiple pathways for our students to access their healing experiences. And so Lisa, Dr. Lim, facilitates some of those programs for us, including things like journaling, art projects, horticulture, so planting or guided meditation walks. She also does some community outreach, and I think about these aspects of her role as also contributing to some of her self-care, because it is often outside of her office space and engaging her in more hands-on activities, different ways of engaging the students in healing, and it's something that our students have been really appreciative of. In addition, my other colleagues have mentioned groups. So I do facilitate a group on our campus for survivors of sexual assault, and there's an opportunity for counseling center interns to support and help with that in addition. And we also have the yoga program as well. So I think those are the only pieces logistically that I'll jump in on right now, and then we can move to the next slides on culturally competent services.
Oh, that would have been helpful.
It would have been.
That would have. Nice. Look how pretty that is.
Well, I can share a little bit about
Yeah.
the bullet points that I didn't talk about. I know. So this is actually an overview of all of UC Irvine's CARE's holistic healing programs, and you'll see there at the bottom, care counselor, that is Dr. Lim's position, but she facilitates some of these programs. So once again, it's important for us to identify different ways for our students to engage in healing. And so some of our students, we have about a 50% Asian American student population. So for many of them, counseling services or advocacy services may not be comfortable or appropriate. And we also support the needs of survivors of historical interpersonal traumas like child sexual abuse or witnessing family violence. And so for them, advocacy services may not also be helpful or appropriate. And so we have our Yoga as Healing program, art support groups. Our music as healing programs include live music experiences as well as healing playlists, some of which have been developed by our staff, some of which are also contributed to by other survivors. So survivors make contributions of songs that they find helpful in their healing, and then we add that to the playlist, and these are all downloadable on Spotify. We have a channel. Our personal safety program, so self-defense classes with trauma-informed instructors. Downloadable resources for students who may not feel comfortable walking into an office, who may have experienced institutional betrayal at some level or systematic betrayal at some level over the course of their personal histories. Our horticulture, which I mentioned, animals, and a healing library so that our students can access self-help resources without having to self-identify by going to a library or spend their own money on books.
So, and such an impressive program. So I'll just bounce off of that a little bit with thinking about culturally relevant treatment and thinking of that in individual and also kind of the systemic level. One of the things that comes to mind for me, this is already getting at sort of the nonverbal treatments, which we've all talked about, which I think is really an important shift that's happening. And just thinking about, the traditional way of processing or repeating through a trauma over and over again doesn't fit with everyone's way of processing, or kind of even just their desires. In addition to that, when I think about culturally relevant treatment, I think about the context of trauma and realizing that, they might come in with, a very specific thing that they want to talk about. But one of the things that they might not even have thought about, and as part of our role, is really to link them with all the ways in which their life in other areas might be being impacted by this, and find them those resources or those support on those things. So traditionally, CARE's been doing this work forever and ever, but I think as therapists sometimes we get stuck in kind of being present with just the current presenting issue, and don't think about how is this impacting you financially, physically, with your relationships, and maybe there's a way that we can get you into a different, housing accommodation that would help alleviate some of that, or maybe we can find you a different grant. So thinking outside the box about how trauma is impacting, and then also thinking about cultural background and also the pieces that might be coming up, that this might be a trigger for a long history of betrayal, and how do we kind of access that in treatment and not just kind of stay in the one piece. I also, one of the things that's been really interesting, and I'm glad Brianna just walked back into the room. No. This is something I would love to kind of have a discussion on the panel and in the audience about. But one of the things I've been really interested in as I've gotten to know CARE's work better is the empowerment model that advocates are trained in, and to really follow the client's need at every step. And I think it's really an interesting and important conversation to start thinking about how do we take that and then add to in terms of cultural differences and needs that people might not be articulating for a variety of different reasons, and how do we help support people with interventions that help elicit different pieces of the puzzle that they might not be comfortable for a variety of reasons advocating for themselves about. So just kind of thinking about how culture, I think, works into maybe some traditional ways that we've thought about responding to trauma. I also just want to mention that I find it really important to try to balance echoing the distress and really hearing the amount of pain someone's in, while holding the amount of resiliency they walk in the door with. And I think that that's a very important piece of being culturally competent and aware, is what are the coping mechanisms that you have been doing your entire life. And maybe it's not my job right now to teach you a bunch of new things, but let's think about what are the resiliency factors that you come into the room with, and really being able to acknowledge that without minimizing the amount of pain and distress someone's in. And I think that that's just a really important balance, and also a balance to find where they're at in that and follow their lead. The last thing I'll say is I find it really important, especially as a white clinician, but just in general with trauma work, to elicit feedback and to have that be named and heard. And when we're thinking about betrayal in systems all around people, to think about how do I make space in the room for someone to tell me when they feel hurt by something I've said, or when I just misunderstand, or maybe I echo something back and it feels too big and they're like, oh my God, I didn't mean I was in that much pain, whatever it is. But being able to make myself vulnerable enough and open enough for them to feel like they can provide that feedback to me. And I think that that's something that survivors really need to feel like they have that voice in the room and then in the system. So I'll pause there.
Do we want to ask if there's any questions?
I want to hear about your culturally relevant.
Oh, you're asking the question?
But then we're going to open it up to questions. But is there anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think we talked in preparing for this. We talked a little bit about, just how we conceptualize the relationship between trauma and culture, and I think one of the main things that we've talked about is the context, but also that sometimes the traditional kind of counseling that we've been trained in doesn't always necessarily fit with the worldview of the students that are coming in. And you kind of spoke to it already, but I had a student who in a very sophisticated way and had already had some therapy before, and shared that at CAPS, and shared that it was somewhat helpful, because I always ask that, if someone's done therapy before, let's find out what worked and what didn't. She had said, yeah, I got a lot of skills, but I don't know how helpful it was. And so kind of towards the end of the session, I was impressed. She said, so how do you work as a therapist? And I really took that like as an invitation to have a discussion. And one of the things that I said was, yeah, we might do some skills, but for me, it's really more about our relationship and you feeling like you can trust me and that I have your back. So I think that's a very different perspective. I think that I bring into the room when I'm working with students from all different types of backgrounds. They're resilient. They have a lot of skills. I think sometimes it can feel like we feel all this pressure. Like I have three or four sessions. I have to give them something, and then push them out the door and cross my fingers and hope that they do okay, or refer them to someone else. So one of the things we've started to talk about is like the flexibility with our model. I think we all agree that we don't tend to stick to a 3 or 4 or 5 session model. I kind of try not to worry too much about how many times I'm going to meet with someone, because I think that can really take away from the freedom to feel like I can build a relationship with someone and that I can do that in however much time it takes. It can be in one session. So we talked a lot about this idea of like giving a gift to a student. And so for me, I think less about giving a gift as like, here's a meditation podcast, but more about doing something for them that they really need. So really being aware of like what's going on in your life and how can I help. This has come up a lot with some of my undocumented students who have a lot of different needs, but most recently, a student who after, they already had kind of a history, they did have a history of childhood sexual abuse and other types of trauma, and then had like a violent physical assault and like a robbery kind of a situation. And so that brings up issues for her immigration status and the type of visa that she is now eligible for based on the trauma that she's been through. So being, we have a lot of power, and this is a new power for me now that I'm licensed and things like that. I can write a letter on this student's behalf for her visa to show that she has sustained trauma and that's part of the reason why her visa might be accepted and might go through. So in session 1, when she told me about what was going on, her parents had already been involved in this legal process, and right away, I happen to know a lot about immigration because of the work that I did at UC Davis, and just coincidentally, my mom works in immigration, so we have a lot of conversations about this. I also immigrated here myself, so I know about the process. So I think being able to have like that credibility and like, even just asking the question right off the bat. So like, what's going on? Like, do you have immigration stress? What's everybody's status? Are you a mixed status family? Like, how can I help? And with that particular student, right off the bat, being able to be, yes, I will provide whatever documentation. Let's get the ROI. I want to know who your lawyer is, and I'll do whatever it takes. I think that's really a way to kind of build that relationship. So that's just one of the things that, yeah.
So we have a floater available to open it up to questions. And we have some questions that we can ask ourselves if you don't have any questions. But I would love to just hear thoughts, reactions, questions to what we've talked about already and how this might apply to your campuses. Everybody wants a care counselor now, right? Yeah.
Maybe for the camera.
I know, but we're recording.
The microphone is for the camera,
Okay,
which I don't know if
great.
that helps or makes it worse. But
We're recording this. Okay.
We are too.
Everybody that has a question, know you're being recorded before you raise your hand. Okay, good to know.
We appreciate you.
So I really appreciate everyone's efforts up here. I'm the liaison to care at UCLA as a CAPS psychologist. And one of the barriers that I feel is probably a lot of campuses are facing is just getting students in the door to CAPS for any type of services that we provide. And we do a brief screen, and then we refer students based on that minimal screening to different types of intakes based on their need. And I recently met with a survivor because I run survivor groups, and like I said, I work with the CARE program, who said she's been waiting for the group Yoga's Healing to open in the winter because she heard from other students on campus it was too hard to get in. And she didn't want to have to repeat her story or have to share her story in a brief 10, 15-minute brief screen in order to get a sooner appointment, et cetera. So I'm just curious, for those of you who are psychologists that work at the counseling centers that are probably just as impacted as ours, how you negotiated to be able to get certain clinical hours devoted to trauma clients walking through the doors, and first of all, how you were able to get that, and then second part of that question would be, were you able to get it so that they could come directly to you so they can meet with less people? So for instance, if it was a referral from the care office or a RA walking someone down and you know it's trauma, how are you sort of directing those students and getting the clinic to get on board with that, to kind of go around the already in place policies that every other student has to do? I know that, did that make sense? Okay,
Absolutely,
I'm seeing nodding from few people, so that feels good. Thank you.
I was just saying that's a really good question, and I think something that we're just constantly evolving. Your answer will probably be pretty different from mine, but so our kind of work in progress that we have right now is in my role, will take, so we do a similar thing as screen, but we do a phone triage, and I found that being able to, so when someone from care refers a student to me, usually they haven't been screened before, maybe they have, but it's time for them to be screened again, and I will just do that directly. And I find that that works well, particularly over the phone, even though maybe it kind of sounds harsh, but to contain a little bit over the phone, I know it will be, we won't spend, it won't be an hour and a half intake. And that's another piece of it. We do have longer intakes, and I find that my intakes do end up taking sometimes almost 2 hours with the trauma survivors. So that's a piece of it. So what I do is I'll do the screening, and then I sometimes, it depends on what's appropriate based on my clinical judgment. I might take them on. So far I've probably taken on, I would say, almost every single person that I've screened, but maybe have referred a few out. And then so that might be either referring them off campus or referring them to another provider if it isn't someone. So having to develop that criteria of who will I take and who will I give out, that's also kind of a work in progress. But generally, like if it's a more recent trauma, if there's a Title IX case, something like that, if they're undocumented, different things. Yeah, I think that there might have been another question that I didn't answer in that, but that's how we've kind of navigated it so far. It's working so far, but it could change.
So I've had also really evolving process about this, and I've arrived at a place I'm feeling sort of confident in the moment. That could change. So if the student comes to the care office first, we have that pretty streamlined, so I'll talk to that first. So if someone is with a care advocate and the care advocate brings up emotional or psychological support and they're open to it, even if they're hesitant, I've implemented a half-hour consult process where I will come and meet with them in their advocacy appointment and just tell them about therapy, just provide some psychoed, and kind of assess some of their history and kind of some of the current needs, just to get a sense of, is this going to be longer term work, is this more complex trauma, and then I'll basically triage and I'll make some decisions about who the best person for them would be. And I want to say a part of that, which I didn't say earlier, is over the summer I met with about 16 individual therapists in the community that self-identified as being interested in working with trauma. And I narrowed that list down to 7 people that I feel confident with working with our survivors. And so I have that list and those people in my mind as I go into these kind of care triage appointments where if the person does have transportation and has the ability to pay a copay, I'll sort of tell them that I have this great person that's a really good match, and I'll make that so that it eliminates the bouncing between therapists. More times than not, they don't have the transportation or the ability to pay a copay, and so that is not always the easiest option. And so then I'm thinking, is this someone that should come to me for some reason or another? There's lots of reasons for that. Or is this someone that one of my team members or someone else at CAPS can see? And then if so, what's their earliest availability? What are their needs? How do I then get a release of information with everybody and kind of coordinate that referral, check back in with them and make sure that they feel like that's working well. If they don't come to CAPS first and they identify as a survivor at intake, therapists at CAPS have different styles, but a lot of therapists will then consult with me. Should I keep this person? Is there a different place to refer them to? what is my comfort with keeping this person? What support do I need in providing this service? And also if they identify that way at the front desk, oftentimes sort of similar to what you're saying, that then they're triaged to one of the therapists that has identified themselves in that way. And similarly, if they're saying that to anyone on campus, like, I don't want to do an intake, but like that, I oftentimes get the phone calls and the emails of that, and then respond directly to the student.
And as far as the logistics of how to make it work, I'm going to leave that to Dr. Diaz from our counseling center. But I will say that it's been one of the most helpful parts of our arrangement to be able to make those direct referrals. So if a student comes to the care office, for that student to be able to then contact Lisa directly and to be able to ask for an intake with a specific person that individual knows works with the care office has reduced a lot of barriers for our students. And I think that's really important because our students come in often having to navigate a complex system of both on and off campus resources. And so to be able to get them connected to services quickly and efficiently is really important for them. To refer them off campus where there may be barriers or therapists may not understand the on-campus processes or options that are available to them might pose additional challenges for those students that we really want to be able to be in a position to serve, because we know that so many of our students are impacted by intimate partner violence, by sexual assault, by stalking. So our housing communities and other folks on campus also know that if they have a student that's been impacted by sexual violence or relationship abuse, they can call and ask for an intake with Lisa. And what's been really nice is that becomes sort of like a code. Like, just ask for Lisa. And then they don't have to talk to the person on the phone when they call the counseling center and say, this is what I've been through and why I want to talk to this person. They just say, can I have an appointment with Lisa? And Francis, if you can talk a little bit about how you make that work on your end, I'm sure that would be helpful.
So how we make that work at CAPS is because of the magical work of our clinical services director, who's in the room. So it's been a lot of, I will say, in full transparency, for those of you who are thinking about trying to set something up like this on your campuses, it has been a sort of a labor of love. It does take a lot of time and logistics and thinking through, because we also wanted to be mindful of, like, what about those other students and how are they not getting in? And but I think it's really important to recognize that there's a specific need for these students, and there's something about having them to retell their story multiple times that can actually be very re-traumatizing. And if we're ultimately thinking about what's in the best interest of the client or the student, the more that we can streamline that process, the better. And if ultimately we're not the right resource, then if there's a way that we can get them connected to the right resource, we want to really be able to think about that. So it has taken a lot of time with Dr. Yamada and I and sitting down and really sort of trying to think through, how do we organize this schedule? Do we create her own separate wait list? And how do we have a separate wait list for Lisa versus the main wait list? And how do we do that? We don't want wait lists. We have to meet the OP sort of invited suggestion of not having more than 10 days before you can see someone, right? So there's all the parameters that we need to sort of try and stay within, and we've been able to do that. It's kind of remarkable that we've been able to do that, but I think that there's been some glitches along the ways in terms of staff sometimes still unclear of, well, can I see the student who's come in on my intake and didn't come in through Lisa, or do I need to give everybody to Lisa? I'm like, no. Lisa cannot see everyone, and she's here to offer additional support. We want you to still continue to feel confident in your own areas of expertise. She's available for consultation. So Lisa does have several initial assessments on her schedule, 2 of which are blocked specifically for care referrals. And if 48 hours before, 2 business days before, it has not been filled, it will get released for the general student population. So that's how we sort of negotiated that. Now there are times where somebody might come in urgently and they need to be seen. So ideally they can show up on her urgent care shift, but if her urgent care shift has already passed, she and I often sit down and negotiate how we can sort of move the schedule around and what's realistic in terms of whether we can accommodate the student in that week, or do we need to sort of come up with some sort of solution so that maybe the student can get some sort of auxiliary support through one of the holistic healing programs and then come in the following week or at her next available. But our front desk are trained. They know, oh, when someone asks for Lisa, they just, okay, here we go. They don't need to ask, they'll ask the basic, we need your name, can we call you, can we secure message, all those basic logistics. But it sort of really does help remove some of the stigma of saying, well, I'm calling, I hear you have a trauma-focused therapist and that's the one I want to see. Or the care office is telling me, because in that way it sometimes outs the student in other ways. And so them just being able to ask for her by name has been really helpful. Now, this is just a postdoc, so the position is supposed to end at the end of this training year. So we have to eventually we will need to think ahead in terms of what kind of system we'll be able to have in place to continue to offer support for the students moving forward. And I think the thing, and this is sort of jumping into a different question, but I think one of the things for us that I'd like to see that we do need to bridge the gap around is then the connection to psychiatry. Because again, our psychiatry in CAPS is a consultation model, it's a short-term model, and our psychiatry at Student Health Center is so impacted because of the limited resources. So, how can we make sure that if there's a student who needs that particular resource, that we're working together to sort of bridge that gap. So other questions? Okay. Comment. Just don't want to trip as I make my
I'll say while she's migrating over there that I've also been able to have the luxury of identifying a psychiatrist who is passionate about working with trauma, and I also have a monthly consultation with her and work on case consultation with her. So if possible to identify people in key places across campus that can be part of this collaboration, all the better.
Yeah, that kind of piggybacks onto my question, is I'm a psychiatrist at Student Health, and I know with trauma, that's one of the areas that the randomized trials suggest some forms of psychotherapy are more efficacious than others. And one of the challenges we've often had is the student health coverage in the community. We're seeing people usually that are longer term cases that the counseling center has determined most part that they're beyond the level and they're being referred to longer term care. But challenge we see a lot of times is that we can't find persons that are trained in like Foa Rothbaum model or Resnick's model or whatever, Clark Eller's model. They don't even know who these people are. And they're getting mostly randomized controlled trial supported therapies. And it's a little awkward because we're supposed to be providing informed consent to the persons that we're talking with, and it's hard to have an educated consumer who then gets educated and is told, well, you can't access that. It's often a really difficult kind of a situation for us. And I don't know if you have any suggestions on how to build more networks of persons that have expertise who might see students. This is what we struggle with all the time. We have wonderful supportive therapists, and we have randomized controlled trials that suggest there are treatments that are even more efficacious than wonderful supportive therapy. And we really do want to give our students, treatments that are just like the medicines that are supported strongly in randomized trials.
Yeah, I think that brings up a good point, and that's something that isn't just for trauma survivors, and something that, at Davis in our integrated model we talked a lot about. I think there's ways of bringing evidence-based treatments to campus. One of the ways that I've been thinking about it, and I'm not sure, I saw a few places that are doing it. You can, there's cognitive processing therapy can be done in a group setting. It's done at the VA. That's something. That's one way of doing it. But another thing that we have to remember, especially because we're here talking about cultural competency is that a lot of the randomized control trials, who is that really being tested on? Is that a, what kind of a sample? What's the ethnic background of those students or of the population? Because not all of those treatments really fit with the worldview. Of these students, I recently had a client who did do some prolonged exposure, and she felt re-traumatized by it. It was not healing for her because she wasn't ready for it. The clinician went a little bit too fast, and she was deferring to the power of the clinician. And I think it made it hard for us to really build a relationship. So I think, we have to hold both of those things. So is there a way that we can bring that to campus? And also, we have to remember that that's not always the magical answer to everything, too. I don't know if that kind of makes sense.
I have so many thoughts, but I think maybe for the sake of time, I'll just say this, that the other piece of that I, maybe you and I can have a long discussion about this sometime, but is what's the measurement of success in those studies. So much of my work with survivors is about finding out what's their definition of healing. What does that mean for them? And there is so many ways we've imposed an expectation around what is trauma, what are the symptoms, how is it diagnosed, and what is you being fixed, that I actually don't think matches the experience of a lot of people I work with. I would say a majority of the people I see don't meet criteria for PTSD, and yet they are shattered and are dealing with so much impact in their lives. And so I think even just the way we've set up a lot of these treatments is a narrow definition of the impact of trauma. What I do resonate with that I think we need to have a broader discussion about is how do we get clinicians on campus and off campus that feel confident and self-efficacious about their ability to work with trauma, because I actually think that's like the most important curative factor, is someone that feels like able to hold the anxiety that comes with this work, the pain that comes with this work, and is willing to do it, and is willing to consult and to keep learning and to keep training, and I think that's like the thing that I always am looking for.
Do you want to say something first?
No, I was just going to, in the interest of time, I was going to ask a question, but I'll let you.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in with one thing, is that sometimes just holding somebody in that space, even for a short time, is most healing. I can't tell you the number of students that have come to us prior to having this model who felt additionally traumatized by being referred out because they felt that they were so broken that they were beyond repair and that somebody didn't want to see them. And so even being able to work in a short-term model to address one or two of the symptoms in the immediate moment, and then being able to refer to a solid network of outside therapists can make a tremendous difference in the experience of a survivor.
So I think in terms of time, if I could ask you all to just sort of talk about what your vision is for where you would like to see these positions on your campuses going, if possible, or how you continue to work with trauma survivors on your campus, and sort of the hope. Let's be hopeful.
Sure. Well, I've had a surge of hope in just coming here to this conference and actually being able to start to collaborate with my peers who are already doing this work and really learn from them. So I think some of my hopes are really to I've already spoke to it a little bit, but really to kind of develop our groups, holding both kind of maybe the nonverbal ways of healing, the yoga, other types of things, and maybe some other types of groups that I already mentioned, like more exposure type based groups. Just really building my collaboration with both of my kind of partners or my teams on campus. And really streamlining, making sure that I have the support that I need, I think is really important. Kelly and I have talked a lot about, this is not an easy role, and so we really rely on each other, and so I think being able to build that as well is going to be a really important part of it. And then to have these both on campus and off campus kind of like networks of people that can support our work as well will be really important, and I'll have to play a significant role in trying to develop that as well. So yeah. I saw a hand back there. Uh-oh.
Should we go to the hand before I? Okay. Brianna wants to add to my vision for UCSB. So I'll say broadly and then come back to B, but just sitting here and being in this conversation, my hope is that every campus would have someone like this, and that we could become more of a network and be able to support each other. That's definitely a dream. And in addition, that psychologists and treatment providers could have a seat at this table. It's really interesting, historically, conversations nationally about sexual assault and sexual violence that are happening don't include psychologists or therapists. So thinking about how do we move into a realm of actually being involved in policy change and shifting the dialogue and maybe rocking the dialogue a little bit, which I'm always open for. So that's kind of a bigger vision. At UCSB, I think I'm doing it. I want to continue to build people that feel more and more confident on campus so that I can spread the love and continue to have a bigger team. I also want to work on my relationships with departments that right now I feel like I rely a little bit on care to kind of bridge some of those for me. But that goes kind of along with the idea of like being in the conversations and yeah. What does Brianna want to add to my vision?
Sorry. So I'm Brianna Conway. I'm the acting director of the CARE program in Santa Barbara. I think for the campuses that might be exploring a model like this, you all have a CARE office, and sometimes you only have one CARE advocate. And so the value that having this consultation has given to our staff of what Callie talked about, the isolation, doing this work, sometimes working with students who have clinical presentations, and I am in over my head, and knowing that I have experts that I can lean in and can help me and alleviate some of that so I can address the advocacy needs and the clinical needs can be really provide this wraparound service is so important. But more importantly, I would encourage, if there's counseling directors in the room, to think about those care advocates who are out there more often alone, more often under-resourced, similar to CAPS, but in smaller numbers. So we're blessed that, we have 3 advocates and then myself, and that's a pretty robust staffing structure compared to some of our UC counterparts. And to be the only person or one of 2 and to not have that clinical supervision, it's just, has historically at Santa Barbara was neglecting that we were dealing with the same human that you all and those difficult presentations. So I'm looking at one of my friends, but in thinking about really that need of clinical supervision for advocacy. And from my experience working in different advocacy sessions, this hasn't been done, and really bringing in, and some of that is the empowerment model, and some of that's confidentiality, and I can talk about all of that, but really valuing that partnership and liaison for supporting our own sustainability in this work.
And
final thing, Mandy, do you want to
Yeah.
go ahead and add to that? And then
Thanks.
we'll come over here. Okay.
So I think that, first of all, I've been very appreciative of the partnership of our counseling center. Having worked at the counseling center in the past and then overseeing the CARE office, I think I have a unique perspective and am able to see the ways in which this kind of a partnership can really benefit our students and our staff folks. I know that from the CARE side, it has doubled our capacity in terms of our ability for our advocate to work with people, because we've been able to support our students a little bit longer on campus. And so for me, I think the vision would be to continue to build something that looks like a treatment team, to be able to offer support in different ways to the same individuals in a coordinated way, and also then support one another in this work. Because I know it can be hard, and these issues can be challenging, especially when somebody's navigating different systems. So I'm interested in exploring some of these treatment team models that some of the campuses have been adopting as well.
I think we might be at time, but I'm going to go ahead and we're going to...
There's always time.
Okay, this has been really inspiring and opening, and I'm just wondering why none of you, or other than the gentleman here, is not including student health. There's a lot of medically trained people who are also very trained in psychosocial situations, and you're not including student health. None of that has been noticed. I keep hearing the word partnership, but that's being left out, and I think you're missing the boat with that. We have a questionnaire. They come in. They may come in for a sore throat, and we're going to read their health history, and it's going to say they have some crisis going on. They had a parent die. They had something else. I don't know your definition of trauma, but I do know what it is. And when we turn to CAPS, we don't always get an appropriate helping hand. So I think you need to kind of broaden your spectrum a little bit here about the word partnership and who you're partnershiping with. People in the medical profession do have that background and training. And I thank the psychiatrist for bringing up that issue.
I'm going to answer that briefly before the next, but I want to hear from you too. I'm sorry you didn't hear us say that, but that is happening. So I have a trauma-identified nurse practitioner that does all of our IPV intakes at Student Health. I have a trauma-identified psychiatrist that does most of my referrals and case management with us. I work with Student Health. I've done trainings at Student Health. I've done dialogues at Student Health. I work with all the social workers in an integrated model there in Student Health. So that is a large part of my team that I have created. Yeah.
We can make it more explicit. Yeah. I'm going to go ahead and let the person in the back.
Okay. Did you want to say?
I definitely don't need the microphone.
But you never know.
I'm going to try to be diplomatic, but I don't think that that's a fair characterization. I think that the relationship between CAPS and student health on every campus is very nuanced, and there's a lot of politics involved, and I think it's a lot more complicated, even with what you were saying that there is an integration. I just see how kind of merging the two divisions or departments is kind of a special experience and process.
The only thing I did, sorry.
Oh, no. So what I was just going to say, kind of wrapping up, is it is a delicate process. And I think that regardless of where you are on your campus, you have to take a first step, right? And so while the vision may be eventually that we can have our student health integrated fully, and in some instances we have that, we also have to recognize that our resources are divided, limited, spread differently throughout our different campuses. So if you feel that you're in sort of a little bit of despair because it's like, I can't get there, this is going to start by taking one step at some point. So I will say in full transparency, Mandy reached out to me a year and a half ago to develop this position, and it was sorry, can't do it. I said no. We said no, we can't do it. And she was persistent and creative and keeps trying. And so I said, okay, well, let's start with a postdoc. Let's figure out what that looks like. And so, you know, on your campuses, you've got to be willing to start somewhere. We have the goal of where we want to eventually get towards, and hopefully it includes all the levels of clinical care, even, you know, nurse practitioners, medical providers, dietitians, whatever it is. We want to be able to have a comprehensive, holistic approach to our students. But we got to start somewhere. So take that first step, reach out to your colleagues, get the ideas, and let's brainstorm and figure out how to make this happen. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you for wrapping that up. Thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it.